Hello, my name is Katalina Garcia, and this is my presentation on action potentials in cardiac contractile cells. I do have to say that I have a slight cough and sore throat, so bear with me. Okay. So for this mini presentation, I will first go over action potentials, the general of cardiac contractile cells with an image of what that depolarization looks like. And then we will go into cardiac contractile cells in research. So, action potentials in cardiac contractile cells. Unlike the membrane of autorhythmic cells, the membrane of contractile cells remains essentially at rest, which is around 290 millivolts, until excited by electrical activity, which is then propagated from the pacemaker. Myocardial contractile cells have several subclasses of potassium channels, and at resting potential, the type of potassium channel that is open is especially leaky. The resultant outward movement of potassium through these channels keeps the resting potential close to the potassium equilibrium potential, which, as I stated earlier, is 290 millivolts. Once the membrane of the ventricle myocardial contractile cells is depolarized to threshold via the current through gap junctions, an action potential is then generated, and changes in membrane permeability and potential follow. So this image that we have to our left is the membrane potential versus time, so we can see visually what is happening. I believe you can see my mouse, so I'm assuming you can see my mouse, but here we can see this threshold potential of -70, and then here starting at -90, we see how the influx of sodium causes our rise to our positive 30 millivolts. Further, this image specifically, action potentials, this is the action potential in the cardiac contractile cells. The action potential in these cells differs considerably from the action potential in cardiac autorhythmic cells. The rapid rising phase, which we see here from this sodium, and then we see how fast it rises. Again, this is milliseconds this time here. The rapid rising phase of the action potentials in contractile cells is a result of the influx of sodium, as I stated earlier, on opening of the fast sodium channels at threshold. So once it reaches threshold, we have this incredibly fast influx of sodium, and then that fast spike that you see here. Continuing on, the early brief repolarization of the potential reaches its peak because of the limited potassium efflux on opening of transient potassium channels. This, coupled with inactivation of the sodium channels, causes this plateau. The prolonged plateau phase is a result of slow calcium entry on the opening of the L-type calcium channels. This, coupled with the reduced potassium efflux on closure of several of the potassium channels. Then we have this rapid falling phase, and you can see here potassium is leaving, so the efflux of potassium. The rapid falling phase is a result of, as I said, the calcium efflux on opening of the ordinary voltage-gated potassium channels, as in other excitable cells. Resting potential is maintained by the opening of the leaky potassium channels. So that's what we see here as it goes back. So we have our leaky potassium channels. After that rapid rising phase, the plateau, and then our rapid falling phase, again from different stimulus, but all together activating each other. So this is a visual graph of the action potential in cardiac contractile cells. So after this action potential, we have a contraction. So this image here, we see how the cardiac contractile cells then initiate a contraction. So again, Again, this is calcium entry from the ECF, which induces a much larger calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. In cardiac contractile cells, the L-type calcium channels lie mostly in the T-tubules. As we just discussed, these voltage-gated channels open during a local action potential. This is unlike in skeletal muscle cells where calcium diffuses into the systole from the ECF across the T-tubule membrane during a cardiac action potential. This entering calcium triggers the opening of a nearby ryanodine calcium release channel in the adjacent lateral sacs of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Further, by the means of this action, calcium entering the systole from the ECF induces a much larger release of the calcium into the cytosol from the intracellular stores. The resultant local burst of calcium release, because it was just a big burst of calcium, what results from this is known as the calcium sparks from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Collectively, the increase of the cytostolic calcium pulls sufficiently to turn on the contractile machinery. So calcium entry, this picture is visually representing what I'm saying, but calcium entry from the ECF induces a very large calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum is basically what I'm trying to get at. 90% of the calcium needed for the muscle contraction comes from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. 90% of the calcium needed for muscle contraction comes from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The extra supply of calcium, because again, it's a huge influx of calcium, the extra supply of calcium coupled with the slow calcium removal is responsible for the long period of cardiac contraction. So the long period of cardiac contraction is a result of the extra supply of calcium as well as the slow calcium removal. So this results in that long cardiac contraction, which lasts around 3 times longer than the contraction of a single skeletal muscle fiber. So again, this is all in contrast of a contraction of a muscle fiber. So a muscle fiber has a contraction of around 100 milliseconds, whereas this cardiac contraction has a contraction of 300 milliseconds. Again, this is because of the extra supply of calcium, as well as the slow removal of the calcium there. So again, looking at this picture, the role of cytostolic calcium is to bind with the troponin. I'm sorry. In skeletal muscle, the role of cytostolic calcium is to bind with the troponin, tropomyosin complex, which then physically pulls away to allow a cross bridge and then the contraction. But unlike in skeletal muscle, where there is sufficient calcium is always released to turn on all the cross bridges, in cardiac muscle, the extent of cross bridge activity varies with the amount of cytostolic calcium available. So here in this image, we can see how we talked about in the last slide, that action potential here, as we can see here, the action potential, how it causes the contraction of our cardiac muscle. Again, this contraction lasting around 300 milliseconds and being largely due to the extra supply of calcium available, as well as the slow breakdown and removal of that extra calcium. So that's 3 times longer, the contraction for cardiac muscle cells compared to skeletal muscle cells. So this research here looks at the effect of sodium overload on the cardiac cells. So sodium overload accompanies many pathologies as well as induces cardiac arrhythmias, which we know are fatal, can induce fatal cardiac arrhythmias. So this research investigated the effects of this elevated intracellular sodium on the cardiac action potential, which we just discussed earlier, as well as on intracellular calcium. So what research found was that during rapid pacing, and this is what this this image here is from Faber and Brody. it shows action potential duration, this basic cycle length, and then we have our variations here. So the results of this research are that during a rapid pacing, the action potential duration actually shortens in two phases. So this rapid phase without the sodium accumulation, and then a slower phase that depends on sodium. So the rapid action potential duration shortens because of incomplete deactivation of the potassium channels current. The slow phase is due to increased repolarizing currents of the sodium potassium the slow phase is due to increased repolarization of the sodium potassium currents, as well as reverse mode sodium calcium, which is secondary to elevated. Researchers also found that sodium overload slows the rate of the action potential depolarization. This allows time for a greater calcium current activation and also enhances a reverse mode sodium calcium current. The resulting increased calcium influx then triggers a greater transient calcium. The reverse mode sodium calcium current alone can trigger the calcium release in a voltage and sodium dependent manner. Lastly, what researchers found was that during the sodium potassium current, sodium and calcium accumulated, and the action potential depolarization, the action potential duration shortened due to that enhanced reverse mode sodium and calcium current, as well as from the contribution of the potassium sodium current to the action potential duration, which shortening is negligible. By slowing this action potential depolarization, hence the velocity, and shortening the action potential duration, sodium overload acts to then enhance the inductibility of reentrant arrhythmias. That's how those two connect, is that this slowing of action potential depolarization and action potential duration. So that those two coupled are what enhances the inducibility of reentrant arrhythmias. These shortened action potential durations coupled with the elevated calcium also predisposes patients with myocardium to arrhythmogenic delayed after depolarizations. So here in this image, what we see are just a summary of the relationship between action potential duration and pacing frequency. So in this image, we see steady state action potential duration, which is approximately 185 milliseconds for cycle length. That's this one here. This, again, I'm assuming you can see my mouse. It's this one with the squares. That's the steady state action potential duration, which is, again, approximately 185 milliseconds for cycle length. And then we see our sodium and peak intracellular calcium concentration at the corresponding cycle lengths. And this is also plotted. This shows and that's the triangle one here. And then our circle one here. This shows the concomitant rise of sodium and calcium as cycle length decreases. So the rise of calcium and sodium, and then the decrease of cycle length. The accumulation of these intracellular ions is due to the inability of the sodium-potassium pump and the sodium-calcium exchange to balance the rate of ion entry. The rise of these intracellular ions affects several sodium and calcium dependent currents. This then again results in the shortening of action potential duration, as well as other changes in cells' electrophysiologic properties as these researchers investigated. So again, this research looked at the effect of sodium overload on the cardiac cells. It found that action potential duration is shorter in two phases. The first being, I lost my train of thought. The first being a rapid phase without sodium, and then a slower phase that is dependent on that sodium. So again, These are my references. And this was our look at action potentials of cardiac contractile cells, as well as cardiac contractile cells in research. And my name is Katalina Garcia. Thank you for listening.